Welcome to another edition of Only Plants, and today I'm going to be talking to you about herbicides, in particular glyphosate, and its use in an ecological setting. Now, I'll tell you what my background is in order to do all this. I had licenses for about 10 years in Massachusetts, Vermont, New Hampshire. I had a supervisory license in New Hampshire, which is very hard to get. Um, and I worked for agencies like National Wildlife Refuges, Fish and Game, Fish and Wildlife, Department of Conservation and Recreation, state agencies, Parks and Rec, municipalities, private landowners, almost Army Corps of Engineers, almost everyone you could think of, also Department of Defense. So I've done a lot of different types of work for different people, all invasive habitat management. So I've been killing invasive plants for 10 years in New England, and I've really found like the ideal ways to do it. And it's based on a couple different things that we'll get into. Um, but this video is really intended to be used by landowners who have questions about herbicide, want some real life information about it, and don't want to listen to news and different people have all kinds of ideas about herbicide. So it's intended for landowners, it's intended for land managers who are getting asked these questions by landowners about herbicides, state agencies, anyone who's looking to do habitat management on their own property, when you may consider using an herbicide rather than just doing it on your own, and anyone else who has questions about herbicide. So the big debate, right, is about cancer and glyphosate. And when you look at this, you need to break it down and ask the question, where is this stuff being applied? And so there's big companies behind this, right, like Monsanto and DuPont, who make a lot of these herbicides. And what happens is the way that we get it to us is through food. And a lot of these GMO crops like corn are genetically engineered to be glyphosate resistant. So they're called Roundup Ready crops. And what they do is they spray multiple times throughout a growing season the entire field, and it kills the weeds underneath the crops that they're going to harvest, that then either get ingested by livestock that gets fed to us, or directly through food that then we would eat. And so there's a lot of myths out there about glyphosate, and I have had multiple conversations about people, town meetings, all ran the gambit of the way that the way that I've interacted with herbicide and people and their questions. And so I've answered a lot of questions. I've thought about this very intensely for a really long time. And I figured out how to sort of navigate the nuanced approach to using herbicides for invasive plant control, and sort of how to talk about it in an intelligent way that makes sense, in order to move forward with habitat restoration. So the industrial farming setting is one use of glyphosate in our environment. The other is the ecological setting. So in an ecological setting, you're applying herbicides once a year. It's usually very targeted, so just on the invasive plants. You try not to hit the native plants because you want those to outcompete. Once you sort of give the natives a leg up, outcompete the invasive plants that are maybe present in the soil. So you're applying it once a year, only to invasive plants, um, and you may not apply it the next year or the year after. You're going to have an initial year of treatment, and then you have maybe a year of monitoring where you go back and you actually see what's germinating, what you missed. Maybe you do a touch up. It's not as intensive as the first season of treatment. And the amounts of herbicide that you use in an ecological setting are very small. So in a gallon of water, say, you use about 6.5 ounces of herbicide with a little surfactant, which we can get into later. So you mix that into a gallon. Now, 6 ounces in a gallon, a can, this is 12 ounces. So in a gallon of water, you're going to put this much herbicide in it, which is a very small amount, overall, to do what you do. And you might be able to treat a whole acre, with one backpack gallon of juice, we call it. And so you could go out there and do that, and that's going to give you so much more. It's economical. So it probably costs, like, to mix a gallon of glyphosate in water, it's $1.50, something like that. So it's very low cost, and you get really high reward with it. You go out there and you do your invasive plant control, and you get that acre under wraps for $1.50 and your hours of time that you spend out there. Now, glyphosate in the environment, if you have um, intact soil, so that means you have microbes in there, fungi. Basically, the soil is acting like a regular ecosystem. Um, in an industrial farming aspect, they use fertilizers over and over, so your soil is very degraded. And so if you're spraying herbicides, any kind of herbicide, on a industrial farming setting where your soil isn't really good, you don't have those microbes or fungi present, runoff happens, right? So now we're having that glyphosate sit on top of the soil. It's not getting broken down by microbes and fungi like it would out in the woods somewhere. And so it's not binding to the soil, and it's running off into our waterways. And because you have multiple applications of that herbicide throughout a growing season, there's a lot of runoff that's going to happen. The ecological setting, you don't have that happening. The glyphosate binds to the soil really quickly. It's broken down by the microbes that are present and sunlight. So the half life, and this is on the label, the half life of uh, glyphosate is 40 days. So in 40 days, you're going to have half the amount that was present, and so on. So it's a exponential curve in reverse, whatever that is. So that's how that happens in the industrial farming setting. That's not what's happening. And so you have to be able to separate these two things and say industrial farming use of glyphosate bad, ecological use of glyphosate in the where you're going to get rid of invasive plants and restore an ecosystem good. And we want to do it that way, and you want to make it easy for people to be able to do that, right? So I've heard some different types of things about um, glyphosate in particular, about these companies, Monsanto and DuPont, and they would go out of business if they only sold to ecological companies doing restoration, because there is so little of it used. The big company couldn't be supported, and so it's actually supported by all these industrial farming operations that are using it over and over. Now, that being said, um, if you want to restore your property from invasive plants, you have to go out and do an assessment. You have to figure out what species are present and what their biology is. There are some plants, like woody plants, for example, your honeysuckles, um, bittersweet, burning bush, barberry, anything else that's like a woody tree or shrub. You can basically treat those anytime during the growing season. So in Vermont, in New England, my foliar season didn't start until June 1st, and it ran through until a week or two before leaf off. So you need to have leaves on your plant in order to treat those plants. Now, the woody season for cut stump treatment, where you're using something like a buckthorn blaster, lasts until the ground is frozen in Vermont. So you want to not do it while the sap is running. So it's not, that particular treatment is not a springtime treatment, because the sap is running up from the roots into the foliage of the plant. If you try to do cut stump, it's going to push all your herbicide out. So you want to delay cut stump treatments until the end, as far to the end of the season as you can. Usually you get better treatments into like October and November than you do in June. Although if you did it like I did, where you're on a schedule, treating a bittersweet vine while you're there in June or July, you have to do cut stump on the bittersweet, because the foliage is all the way up in the trees. Cutting that then, and then seeing what that plant does when you come back the next season. If it resprouts, you can recut it and treat it in November. So you just sort of like alter your treatment times a little bit there. Now, so those are woodies. Woodies can be treated basically any time of year. Um, the herbaceous plants like Japanese knotweed and Phragmites, those are two plants that have a really specific biology to them. And the way that you treat them is to um, wait until after they flower or tassel. So you'll see they don't usually do that until September. They'll start flowering. Now, you wait for the flowers because that means that biologically the plants are basically at the end of their life cycle for that season, and they're going to start sending all of their energy that they've stored up throughout the growing season from the sun back into the roots. And so if you can tag on with a foliar treatment herbicide to those plants, they will take that herbicide back down into the root system. Now, there are other plants too, like garlic mustard, swallowwort, Japanese stiltgrass. These can all be treated at, you know, garlic mustard, stiltgrass. Those are kind of an earlier season treatment, and I would recommend just doing hand pulling for those unless you have a lot of them. So that would be a mechanical control because the herbicide for those, it's in a small amount, you can just get rid of them like that. You don't have to spray those particular plants. But when you get into a mass of them, you want to do those ones earlier in the season before they flower. So, especially the garlic mustard. Garlic mustard, if you wait too long, they will bolt. So they're a biennial. They will bolt and they will flower, and if you pull them and leave them, those and they have seeds starting to form, those seeds will mature on the dead plant and become viable, and then continue to spread. So you have to be diligent about when you choose your timing for particular things. And if you want to ask in the comments if you have particular species that you're wondering about, drop it in the comments, and I will answer when the treatment timing for those is. Now, uh, so, a note about pre-cutting before treatment. Now, you may see this in a lot of places where they say go in and cut your plants, especially for something like Japanese knotweed, because they get 15 feet tall and they're usually really dense and hard to get through, and it's a big patch. People say cut those before treatment. You have to clarify that. And every time that I've actually done that type of treatment where we've cut the plants and then tried to treat them, there has always been a mistreatment. And so I altered how I thought about this particular species, and I decided that what I was going to do was never cut them. So I would always tell landowners, don't cut those plants, let them be tall. And what that does is when you cut a plant, the hormones inside the plant change. And so it wants to sprout. And so, you know, people do this with tomatoes, right? They'll cut back their tomatoes and then you have a lot more flowers, a lot more stems coming out. Same thing happens with knotweed and really any other invasive. If you cut that stem and you don't treat it at that time, which you can't treat the knotweed in the spring when people cut them, um, you will have many more sprouts, and they're not going to be functioning the same way as if you let them grow and be healthy. Healthy plants are easier to kill. And so when the hormones are all out of whack and you try to tack on herbicide to it, it doesn't actually kill the plant and it causes a mistreatment. So all of the sites that I did that to, when I came back the next year, it was like we hadn't been there at all. And there were a bunch of multi-stemmed knotweed plants all over the place, and it became a really hard thing to kill after a while because those plants will become glyphosate sort of resistant in a way. They become a little bit immune to it, and so those sites became a pain because you had to go back over and over, and it was like, how are we gonna fix this problem? But all of the sites where I didn't do that, I left those plants to be full size, let them flower, let them go past flower, and then I went in there and treated as much as I could. And the plants that I actually treated were smoked. It was like, we got our habitat back in 1 year, no problem. And then when I went back the next year, I just had to hit the ones that I sort of missed they're usually in the center because you can't really get to them that way. So you just retreat those, and then it was like, you had 90 to 95% control in 1 year using this method. And the way that I would do it is do a foliar treatment on those. So cut stump on knotweed is terrible because if you've ever cut one, they're watery stems. And so if you put herbicide into a watery stem, you're diluting it over and over. And so that it doesn't become effective. It's not effective for those stems. Additionally, because you're cutting them, you end up walking on them, stepping on them, and it causes a mistreatment. So leaving the plants full size, having a lot of surface area to apply herbicide to with a foliar treatment, you can actually contain knotweed pretty easily within the first year. And a lot of people will tell you that it's impossible to kill knotweed, but I've done it. I've had acres and acres of it controlled in a very short amount of time. And so, if you want to explain glyphosate to somebody, first of all, if you have any questions about a particular herbicide you're using, look at the label. The label is the law. It has tons of information in there, um, things you can Google, ask questions about, restrictions. It tells you how things work, kind of. It also gives you your rates, so what's allowable under that label in terms of how much herbicide you can put into a gallon of solution, as well as what kind of surfactants to use. And while we're here, we might as well just talk about surfactants. Uh, 98% of the time I did herbicide control, I used one herbicide for all of these species of invasive plants, and it was a glyphosate product called Roundup Custom. It used to be called Rodeo, and it's a wetland approved version of this particular glyphosate product. So they make an upland version, but to me, I live in a place where there's a lot of water. I never wanted to have to differentiate between an upland and a wetland. I always wanted to be applying a wetland approved herbicide, even if it was an upland. To me, there was no reason not to be applying a water soluble herbicide, even if it was a drier area, because there would be water there eventually. And so, based on the label, it requires that you mix it with a non ionic surfactant. Now, that just means that uh, if you did get some in the water, it's not going to harm amphibians. Amphibians breathe through their skin. If you have an ionic surfactant that isn't water soluble, it will bind to their skin and basically suffocate them. So the non ionic one becomes water soluble, and you're using such a small amount of it, it really gets dilute and broken down so quickly in the environment, in a intact environment, that it's really negligible in terms of what you're doing, and you can't. It's not really meant to be applied on top of water, so you're applying up to water's edge, and you're modifying your application method along the way. So, you might do foliar up until 20 feet at the edge of a river, and then you're going to do cut stump in there, which is going to eliminate the chances of any herbicide getting into that waterway. So there's these nuanced approaches to how you apply, what you apply, and what application method you use in particular areas based on how close you're getting to something or where you are or what the species is. Um, and so the wetland approved herbicide with the non-ionic surfactant, which the surfactant basically, leaves have a waxy coating on the upper side and bottom side of their leaves, which allows them to retain moisture. So, in order to get an herbicide into a plant, you have to break down that waxy, it's called a waxy cuticle. And the surfactant is what does that. So, it's really like a soap. And if you think about what soap does to like grease, it helps break that down, and it tacks on the herbicide into that leaf's system and gets it down into the root system. And so that's the way that I've done it for 10 years, had really good success. A wetland approved herbicide, a non ionic surfactant, uh, application timing based on the biology of the plants, trying to figure out when the best time to treat those is. Um, and then doing, having a really good plan in the beginning, treating healthy plants and hitting them hard the first time. So if you kind of hold back and you don't treat them with the right percentage of herbicide, um, and the right or the at the right time or with the right biology in mind, you're going to have a harder time treating those plants later, because they're going to be there's going to be a mistreatment, and their functioning isn't going to be as good as it was when they were healthy, and they were easy to kill when they were healthy, and now they're kind of like deformed and not really working correctly, and so it's going to be really hard to get herbicide into that system to kill them. So I hope that, ask me any questions you have in the comments. I hope that this um, at least answers some questions about herbicide and glyphosate, especially with the idea that there's a difference between application in industrial farming versus an environmental habitat restoration approach. And I hope that we can, as a group, can sort of have a line there of what we understand and when things are appropriate to ban or use, and how we should do that. So, uh, thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe, share it, comment. Appreciate all of you. Have a good night.